Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be really tight on time because we have until 10 minutes to 9 here, so gently hosting us during this day of protest in public university. So I would like to start this panel, the third wave of legacies, state legacies, rupture, and continuities, about the way societies have dealt with the legacies of their authoritarian experiences. Democratic transition, like the cases that we'll see today, is never a point-like event, but rather a structure where many disputes about the meaning of the past coexist. We're going to start with Diego Palacios. We'll talk about the challenges of police reform in Spain when the institutional past hasn't been faced, but also Maite Gorosito from Argentina will underline the role of the ESMA Museum, place of memory, as a democratic place of memory 10 years after its creation. Claudia Marchand, linked to Londres 38 in Chile, will prove the way struggles for memory were reactivated during the upheaval of 2019, revealing open tensions. And to my right, Jaime Pastor will invite us to think the fragile border between democratization and authoritarianism. So after I will give the floor to every panelist, and then we'll have a discussion that will pick back the discussion of the former panel. But we have to leave at 10 minutes to 10. So thanks a lot for sharing, and the floor is to Diego. Thanks a lot, Carolina. Thank you to the organizer for thinking that what I was proposing to tell would be interesting. Cornetis referred to me in his intervention less than an hour ago, saying that my perspective of revisionist, well, maybe, but it's revisionist because about an object on which I'm working now, and when you work on a new research project, you find many things you didn't expect, and you like to think things again and getting out of pre-established proposition, and the results are revisionist. And at the same time, there are historical events that the colleagues hasn't paid attention to, but for me are quite striking, and you build your interpretation on the basis of those striking events. I'm gonna say brief things before. In the last years, there have been an advancement of the knowledge of some aspects about the relationship between the police and society. David Ballester, for instance, rebuilding very well the circumstances of many dead people in control of demonstrations, torture, use of weapons, fire weapons in checkpoints, thanks to David Ballester. And Sophie Babi, her book on the myth of the peaceful transition, has highlighted the bloody character of the Spanish transition. But while I studied, I have been working many years on the Portuguese case, the Carnation Revolution, and the police reform in Portugal. In an international context, David Ballester, his conclusion about what happened in the transition with the police apparatus is that it changed a little and too late. And with the same indicators put in comparative context, even with Portugal, besides the dissolution of the political police, but the rest of the political of the police force in Greece. Until '84, you don't see visible changes, but also all Latin American countries, with the Eastern Socialist countries, the most striking of the compat in the Spanish case is extreme velocity and the deepness of the transformation of the Spanish police effort. This goes against an idea of the memorialist activities. The victims of the police, the torturers weren't punished, but those facts that are central and very true, the conclusion is that nothing changed. But if we want to indicate what happens with the police apparatus of the transition, we find that that link between non-punishment of perpetrators or tortures and non-chain cannot be sustained. That's the starting point. In a year, in December '76, it will be the 50th anniversary of police demonstrations in Madrid. The Suarez government doesn't know what to do, so first demo of policemen in the Plaza de Oriente in uniform, and they are coordinated with the patrol cars, radios. The whole network would listen to everybody without identity. They were underground of the policemen that were calling for that demonstration. They asked the demilitarization, integration in the social security, and wage improvements. The first episode. Some press publishes some policemen are judged the war trial, and they are freed because of the amnesty law. These are police protagonists that will play a role, somewhat revisionist. We shouldn't just think about the political elites and what the political elites want to do with the police and the terrible things that the police does. We shouldn't see them as a reflect of the police as an apparatus obeying what the political authorities wanted. Mine is a research project that dialogues with these 50 years of the first police demo. Mine is a civic concern. We have many positions in the left. Some say the police has to be abolished. It's not interesting, but we might rather think we should have the best possible police with democratic accountability. We have that range of extremes between different left-wing position. I'm into the second position, how I put forward the relationship with the police reform transition. It's important to get to a strange situation in which all historiography about the repression in the 60s, that sometimes that historiography of repression is cheating a little bit, because they do a history of the repression as it were a history of police force. So we don't explain other facts. In '79, a big poll asking the Spanish people what they think about different institutions. There is a pretty well considered institution is the Crown, the best considered by the Spanish. But the trade unions have a good appreciation, better than political parties on the parliament. But the police is even best appreciated at the average of the Spanish people. It could be the result of a sociological Francoism, but funnily, the worst institution for the Spanish people are the military. So we cannot identify that poll by the state prosecutor office says this. So the average Spanish thought that had a good opinion about the police. So that history of transition doesn't explain the relationship of the Spanish people with the police. We don't know what is there what was in the head of that the people that answered to that poll, several experiences. You had protests by the policemen and a very swift transition. The puzzle to relate to the past is especially complicated if we think that all voices, critical voices inside the police force that we can reconstruct in 76, 2 underground bulletins are published inside the police force with a program for police democracy, democratization from the patrol uniform policemen, and a discourse of police reform that will correspond to the main measures that will be made of transformation of the police afterwards. It's a narrative that is built internally. We don't find this in Portugal. So we should give a certain protagonism to policemen in the transformation. We need more elements that complicate this relationship. That good image of the police force in the poll in 79 will improve as the constitutional life is developed in the following decades, and since 25 years, in all polls, the police is the best appreciated institution for the Spanish positions to become a policeman, policewoman are the most popular. Every year, people with better qualification and the children of the police have to compete with many people that wants to become policemen, policewoman. The contrary of what happens in France. They have to lower in France the requisites, the requirements, because nobody wants to become policeman. We have a trajectory, a very problematic institution that with discourse of memory and nothing changed is problematic. We have two options. We can say it's the best appreciated institution because nothing changed. In transition, the very same Francoist police, we can try to rebuild the relationship between police and society and democracy and the vectors. There are many and very complex to explain that strange popularity in a moment such the current one where the far right is entering the police unionism, and they are appropriating that 50 years after, they are appropriating that popularity of the police force to build a hard discourse that has led the French police 50 years ago. That discourse entered. The far right entered the police force in France 25 years ago, and the discourse from the left that we can do of rebuilding the transformational elements of the police that were positively appreciated by the Spanish citizens since the end of the 70s. The protagonists of many young policemen in the change of the relationship between police and society, the centrality of police transformation at the Moncloa Pact, the unions and the parties asked as police reform, it was done. And the effect of those transformation qualitative polls of the Sociological Research Center in working neighborhoods, not except for the Basque Country, the image of the police is very negative there, but for the rest, they work in Spain with qualitative polls. They are asking the neighbors is more police in uniform patrolling the neighborhoods and offering them security. We have many elements that I think we have to invite us 50 years after to rethink the relationship between police and democracy and to think about the positive elements of the police history and the protagonism of democratic movements in democracy that had lots of weight, and that velocity of the transformation with the indicators of success that I have numbered. How far are the elements that they should lead us to separate some of the discourses about the continuity of the police in Franco is because they disarm ourselves in order to discuss what kind of police we want for the future and which trajectories that could be terrible if the far right enters discourses in the police. So in tactical and strategic terms, a dialogue with the past, able to deal with some delicacy, the different experiences of relationship of citizens with police will only produce it will produce more politically positive results. I think there is a relationship between these 50 years and next year, the 50th anniversary of the first police demonstration for democracy in the force. It would be a good chance to reconsider relationship between past and present. That was my contribution. Thank you, Diego. You've been tied to time. I just want to ask for excuses. Diego Palacios is a professor at the History Department in Sociology, Complutense University of Madrid, and his work is centered on, is focused on the police reform in Spain and the challenges for more democratic models without avoiding the legacies of the past. And now the floor in this to Maiki Gorosito. She's former executive director of ESMA Museum in Argentina. She has participated in the development and implementation of public memory policies, strengthening the institutional role of the museum as fundamental tool for commemorations after 10 years of its creation. Maiki, thank you for coming. First, thanks a lot. I'm really moved and honored of being here. I cannot just thank Torge from the foundation there in Buenos Aires, always supporting this museum. Always Amelia, also Amelia, Elsa, and all the team working for months to make my presence here possible. So out of my heart, I tell you this. I can't see because I have to read my notes. Since tomorrow I will share a moment with you, I would like to share some reflections on the example of the ESMA Museum that was a center for torture and extermination. I was the honored to be the director until I was fired by the current government from that challenging and beautiful role as an example of the politics of memory that we were able to have in Argentina. Also, I want to refer this opportunity to the success of the claims of the human rights organization, the survivors, the families, and the big political will of telling in our region of Mercosur as an institution, ESMA Museum. I would also want to about the importance of these memory places for the consolidation of our democracies, and the ESMA Museum as a symbol of state terrorism based on killing and disparison of people. When in Argentina, when we talk about memory, we talk about memory justice and memory. In this particular case, about what the ESMA Museum represent not just for a country, but also for Mercosur, also for the world, not just because of its inscription in the list of UNESCO Human Heritage List. I think that the museum is an achievement for human rights institutions, an example in the building of public policies for memory, truth, and justice. Also, I would like to talk about how in the museum we try and we were able to contribute sometimes to the building of a regional critical citizenship that can embrace the ethics of never again. Today, the history of this museum, 10 years after, I will always speak as we. The past position is not important. Conviction, persuasion, and is important. The anniversary allows us to think about advances and backlashes about these issues and to reflect about the backlashes in times as of birth, as for the human rights in my country. That's why I always think they are always necessary, but today it's urgent, more reflection, more strategy, and more action. So I would like to share with you a little video that accounts for the content of the museum. Some of you must have visited it, but I always like to bring the voice of the survivors and witnesses. So I'm gonna ask somebody to support me with the showing this video and to stop it at 6 minutes and 54 seconds.
Pasó a mí lo mismo que le pasó a muchos compañeros, digamos, ¿no? Son el mismo operativo, la misma forma, los mismos métodos que escuchamos.
To me, happened the same as the rest of the comrades, same methods. We had like a sort of bazooka, a helicopter, and then suddenly everything was illuminated by big spotlights. When I came outside, I couldn't see anybody because I was. They hit me with the spotlight. What happened afterwards, after you came out? They put your hands on your. I identified as the Tigre Acosta at the ESMA, and they were giving orders of perquisition of the house. They destroyed the whole house. And then I realized they also plundered my house. I didn't have no valuables, but they stole everything.
Quitar toda la ropa, te tiran sobre esa cama con capucha.
They got stripped of my clothes.
De pies y manos, ahí
they tied me hands and foot and feet. They tied some wire to my tiptoe, and they started to torture me. They started to ask me about my militancy in La Plata. That was true, but after that I didn't do any more militancy, so they continued to torture me. As you know, electrical charges on my body, water, the body shaking. Difficult to describe what you feel when you cannot control your body.
estaba así con nosotros. Nosotros no sabíamos nada, lo cuidábamos como un hijo, pero de una
We didn't
manera
know anything. We would take care of him as a
de lo
son.
hermanos que según él tenía desaparecido.
He was.
Hablaba,
They
después
brought
supimos,
the
más que
son
nada,
of
atrás de
the
Azucena, porque ya tenía
detained
planificado
brother.
el descabezamiento
Then we
de su
knew
madre.
through Azucena because they wanted to behead the mothers. Do you
Entonces me quedaba,
remember
como él siempre
how
estaba atrás de Azucena, le dijo, ¿y vos qué haces
at a
acá?
certain point,
Haceme el favor,
since
poneme en este pedazo de
they
diario.
said,
¿Cómo te llamas?
"What are you doing here?
Entonces
Please,
puso Gustavo Niño.
Sí, queríamos saber cómo
what's
se
your name?"
enteraron que Gustavo Niño era artista.
And he wrote
Él
Gustavo
se fue a
Niño.
Francia
We
y en
wanted to
Francia
know
había un padre que le habían llevado 3 hijos.
how you realized that Gustavo
Entonces,
Niño
ellos
was a
tuvieron
thief,
que
a torturer.
migrante a la
They
francesa,
have a
la
mother in
francesa,
France.
y
They
lo vio
brought him
entrar.
3 kids.
Entonces,
She
cuando lo
had
vio
to go
entrar, le
to
dijo,
France, and
uy, estás acá,
she
Gustavo.
saw him
Y se
enter in
llamaba
the
Pedro
building
Escudero.
and said,
Y
"You're
ahí
here, Gustavo."
vino la noticia y se
I
hizo la
thought he was
efervescencia
called
con los
Pedro
mexicanos que
Escudero.
estaban en Francia
And then
para hacer la
came the
averiguación.
news
Pero hasta que salió de acá,
with
y llegó
exiles
allá,
in
que no sé
France
cuánto tiempo
to
pasó, nosotros no supimos que él era el traidor, el entregador.
I don't know how much time passed, and we didn't know that he was a traitor.
Todos los días miércoles, gran parte de los detenidos de la ESMA
Every day, every Wednesday,
eufemísticamente
most
se
of
llamaba el
the
traslado. Es
detainees
decir, eran
were
trasladados a
subject
la
to
base
what
del
was
parque,
what was
desde
called
donde
a
partían aviones de
move
escuadrilla multipropósito y los
from
arrojaban
where
en un lugar fuera de los marcos de
those
la
squadron
playa,
planes would
en un lugar donde ya no había acceso a corrientes marítimas que pudieran
depart,
trasladarlos.
and the people would be
Todos los martes,
thrown
los
into the
oficiales
Rio de la Plata,
inteligencia
where
se
sea
reunían.
currents would
Curioso,
make the
no
bodies
se
disappear.
reunían para decidir a quiénes trasladaban, ejecutaban, asesinaban. Se reunían para discutir a quienes no lo hacían. Por rutina, toda persona que estaba secuestrada en la ESMA estaba automáticamente condenado a un traslado. Esa era la regla. La excepción de semana a semana era no ser trasladado. Ese ejercicio particular de los oficiales de inteligencia se llamaba oficiosamente derecho a veto. Por un lado era una cuestión técnica, mantener detenidos para interrogatorios posteriores o usos posteriores, pero por otro lado también era una muy perversa forma de dirimir el poder y el prestigio dentro del grupo de tareas.
Ahí estaba Martín Gras.
There you could see Martin Gras, a survivor and witness, talking when about the death flights. Most important to say when we talk about the ESMA Museum is that the museum was one of the more than 800 centers of detention during the Argentinian dictatorship between 76 and 83, where some 5,000 men and women passed through, most of them thrown into the sea alive. Some 45 pregnant women detained and killed. Some 20 children were born, some of them appropriated with new identities, then discovered by the peaceful struggle of the families and the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, with 140 grandchildren with their identity recovered. About the crimes of the ESMA Detention and Torture Center, for which the perpetrators were punished, I always detail them. You never have to forget. Torture,
abuso sexual y
privation
violación,
of liberty,
trato inhumano y
sexual abuse,
degradante,
rape,
trabajo forzado,
inhuman treatment,
apropiación de
forced
niños y
labor,
niñas
appropriation of
nacidas en
children born
cautiverio,
in
robo
prison,
de bienes muebles e inmuebles,
robbing of
asesinato, ocultamiento de los cuerpos de las
furniture,
personas asesinadas,
hiding of the
por
bodies
supuesto
of
los
the
vuelos de
killed
la
people,
muerte.
of course, the death flights.
También el grupo de tareas que
Also,
funcionaba en
the
el centro
task
clandestino
force at this underground
realizó
center
tareas en el exterior,
did some
operaciones en
jobs,
el exterior
operation
de
in the
nuestro
foreign
país,
countries,
y en ese
and
despliegue
that deployment,
extraterritorial contó en
extraterritorial
ciertas
deployment,
ocasiones
they
con
counted
personal de
sometimes
otras fuerzas
on
de inteligencia,
personnel
del
from
ejército,
other
de la Fuerza
intelligent
Aérea,
forces, the army,
del
the
Ministerio de
Air
Relaciones
Force,
Exteriores y
Foreign
la Cancillería.
Ministry, Foreign
Y
Affairs
para estas
Ministry.
operaciones, el
For
grupo de
those
tareas
operations, this task
utilizó
force used,
a personas detenidas desaparecidas,
detained, and
se replicaba el modelo de trabajo forzado
disappeared people,
que se
replicating
implementaba
the
al
forced
interior del
labor
centro clandestino.
inside the
Y
underground
esa
center.
metodología
This
implicaba obligar a
methodology
las y los
entailed
prisioneros a
forcing
realizar
the
tareas de
prisoners
inteligencia
to
y
do
logística
intelligent and logistic
vinculadas a las
tasks
acciones en el
related to
exterior.
foreign
Voy a
actions.
tratar de sintetizar esas acciones
I'm going to
que
try
realizó
to
el grupo de
summarize
tareas
these
en el
actions by the
exterior,
task force in
coordinación con organismos represivos de
other
otros
countries in
países, aunque el
collaboration
centro
with
clandestino de
repressive
la ESMA no
forces,
formó parte del
although
centro
the
clandestino
ESMA
que
wasn't a
funcionaron para el
part
Plan
of
Cóndor, el
Plan
seguimiento, la
Condor
intimidación de
detention
militantes y
centers.
familiares
They
exiliados, infiltración
harass
en las
exiled
comunidades de
people,
exiliados,
infiltration in exiled
propaganda política
communities,
para contrarrestar la
political
llamada
propaganda
campaña
to counter
anti-argentina,
the so-called
intentos de secuestro y
anti-Argentinian
asesinato de dirigentes
campaign,
políticos y sindicales en
attempts
el
to
exterior,
kill and
apropiación de
hijack
dineros
leaders
en cuentas del
in foreign
exterior
countries,
y compra de
appropriation
armas,
of bank accounts,
y también tareas en
purchase of
el grupo de
weapons,
tareas
and
en
also
Sudáfrica.
actions
En
in South
América
Africa.
Latina
In Latin
sucedieron
America,
muchas de estas acciones en
many
Paraguay,
of
en
these
Perú,
actions
en
took place in
Uruguay,
Paraguay,
en
Uruguay,
Bolivia, en
Peru,
Venezuela, en
Bolivia,
México y en
Venezuela,
Nicaragua.
Mexico, and
Y
Nicaragua.
aquí en Europa,
And here
en
in
Suiza,
Europe, in Switzerland,
en España, en
in Spain, in
Francia, en
France,
Alemania
in Germany,
y en Italia.
and in
Bueno, y
Italy,
también, como
and
señalé, en
also,
África.
as I said, in South Africa.
Es imposible
It
o
is
difícil
impossible and difficult
sintetizar
to
lo que
summarize
fue
what
el plan sistemático
the systematic
de represión, el plan
repression
sistemático
plan,
de robo de identidades, pero para hablar del museo tenemos que
the
hablar de lo que en el
robbing
centro
of
clandestino
identities,
sucedió.
but for the
Y
museum, we
para
have
hablar
to
del
talk about
museo
what happened
como
at this
representación de una
repression
política
center. The museum,
pública
as
que supimos
an
construir.
example of a public
Voy a
policy we
empezar
were
por
able
el
to build, I'm going
logro
to
más
start
cercano
by the
del museo,
most recent
porque
achievement of the museum.
el museo el 19 de septiembre de
Because
2023
September the
fue incluido en
19th,
la lista del
23,
patrimonio
it was
mundial de la
included in
UNESCO,
the UNESCO World
porque los Estados
Heritage List
miembros de la
because the
UNESCO
member states of the UNESCO
definieron y decidieron
decided
que el
that
Museo Sitio de
the
Memoria ESMA
ESMA
es
Museum
altamente
is highly
representativo,
representative
está estrecha
and
y
is
tangiblemente asociado a la represión ilegal,
very
a
closely
opositores
related
armados y
to
no
illegal
armados,
repression of
ejecutados y
armed
coordinada por las
and
dictaduras de
non-armed
Argentina y de toda América
oppositionists
Latina en la década de los
and
70
done
y los
by the
80.
dictatorships
Y
in
ese
Latin America in the
reconocimiento,
70s
que
and
no fue un
80s,
acto
that
burocrático,
acknowledgement,
sino que
not
fue
a
producto
bureaucratic
de un trabajo de
action,
muchos años,
but rather the
que implicó también
outcome
un gran
of a
trabajo de
long
fortalecimiento
year's
institucional y
work
ampliación de los consensos de
about
las que ya
enlarging
contaba el Museo
consensus
Sitio,
on which
se
the
sumó a una
museum
condición muy
already
importante,
counted on.
una de las últimas defensas
One
que
of
quedan
the
para la
last
institución, que
defenses
es su condición de prueba
is
judicial.
its
También
condition
el
of
Monumento Histórico
judiciary
Nacional, algunos
evidence.
meses antes de ser inscritos en la
And
lista
because
del
before,
Patrimonio Mundial de la
months
UNESCO,
before
logramos ser
becoming
inscritos en la lista de bienes
UNESCO
culturales del Mercosur,
World
que eso
Heritage,
implicó
we
o implica
became
que
also a
los Estados
cultural
partes y
site of the
asociados
Mercosur. This
definieron por
implies
consenso que el
a
Museo
definition
Sitio de
by
Memoria ESMA es una
consensus that the
institución
ESMA
que se debe
Museum is an
preservar y
institution that has
conservar
to be
para la
preserved
transmisión
for
del
the
terrorismo de
transmission
Estado
of
basado en la
state
desaparición
terrorism
forzada de
based on
personas,
forced
que así se cometió.
disappearance of people.
Queda, bueno, si queda un poquito
I
de lo que dijo,
have to choose what to
Bueno,
tell you.
voy a elegir muy rápidamente entonces. Quizás en el video pudieron notar que
At the
el
video, you
guión
may
del
see
museo
that
sitio se basó desde el
the
inicio
script
en el
of this
testimonio de los y las
museum was
sobrevivientes
based on
dictados
the
ante la
uh,
justicia. Eso
testimonies
también
of the
pensábamos
survivors
hasta
of
hace unos
repression.
meses
That's what we
que
thought until some months
era
ago.
una
We thought
defensa
that
para el
it was
museo
a
sitio
defense for the
en
ESMA
relación
Museum
a la imposibilidad de
with
plantear
regards
que el
to
museo
the
sitio transmite una
possibility
interpretación,
of
¿sí?, de la
saying that the
historia,
museum is just an
porque
interpretation,
no es así,
transmits an
sino que el
interpretation
museo sitio
of
transmite lo que sí sucedió porque fue
history.
probado y condenado por la
On
justicia.
the contrary, it does
Entonces,
transmit what really
además de esa
happened that has
condición
been
museográfica,
sentenced by
el
justice.
museo también se pensó como un criterio de
The museum was
reversibilidad y
also
prevención.
thought as a
Por su carácter de prueba
reversibility and
judicial,
minimal intervention because
si el
of
juez
its
le
character
decía,
of
vamos a una inspección ocular,
judiciary
decía, hay que
evidence.
levantar estos paneles,
If we
hay que
have to
correr,
have an
agarrarse de paneles porque tenemos que
ocular
ver si
inspection, you
abajo
have
del
to
piso hay alguna
just
prueba, alguna marca que
make a
señale a los
hole
sobrevivientes y las
in order
sobrevivientes a la
to
prueba para
find
la visita.
evidence of
Bueno,
repression.
teníamos que tener la
We
posibilidad
had to
de
have
hacerlo. Y eso se
the
pensó desde un
possibility of
principio
allowing
con el
that.
equipo
That's what
interdisciplinario
thought
que
from the
diseñó la
beginning with
apuesta
the
museográfica.
interdisciplinary
Y
team
bueno,
that
entonces
designed the
en esta
museum.
breve síntesis que tengo que
So
hacer,
with this summary, I have to do
recordar que el museo sitio
remember
cumplió
that
hace
the ESMA
muy poquito tiempo
Museum
10 años y que es
is 10
imposible
years old.
pensar su camino
It's
sin
impossible
tener en
to
cuenta
think
las
its
diversas
path without
conquistas
taking
en
into
materia de
account
derechos humanos que
several
alcanzamos como
achievements in,
sociedad.
in human
En el
rights
2023
of
celebramos en
Argentinian
Argentina
society. In
los primeros 40 años
23,
de
we
democracia
celebrated
ininterrumpida.
the
En el
first 40
2024
years
se
of our
conmemoraron
anterior
los
to
20 años
democracy,
de la recuperación
24,
del espacio
20
Memoria y Derechos
years
Humanos
of
ex
the
ESMA,
ESMA
allí construidas
recuperation.
las casas de los organismos de derechos humanos
You have
y de
there
algunas
the
instituciones del Estado argentino y también de órganos del Mercosur. Este año
headquarters of several human rights
se
institutions.
cumplieron
This
40
year
años del juicio de la
was the
Junta,
40th
cuando en 1985
anniversary of
se
the
condenaron a 5 de
trial
los 9
of
integrantes
the
de las juntas
juntas
militares
when they
por
were
llevar a cabo un
condemned
plan sistemático de
because
exterminio
of the
y también
systematic
este
plan
año
of extermination.
se
And
cumplieron
also this
50
year
años
was the
del inicio del
50th
Plan Cóndor, que
anniversary
fue la
of the beginning
coordinación
of the Plan
represiva entre
Condor,
los estados
Condor Plan,
de la
the
región
repressive
de la que
coordination
formo
of
parte.
the states
El año que
I
viene se
belong
cumplen
to.
50 años
Next year
del
will
golpe
be the
militar
50th anniversary of the
y
military coup,
nos estamos preparando
and we are getting
para
ready
colmar y llenar las
to
universidades, los clubes de fútbol, las calles,
to
las
replenish
escuelas, los sitios
universities,
de
football
memoria,
stadiums,
con
all
actividades de
places of
reflexión,
memory with that
activismo,
events of
participación
reflection,
y pedagogía de la memoria,
activism and pedagogy of
porque
memory,
preveemos
because we
lo que se
predict,
viene de
we
parte
expect
del
the
gobierno,
onslaught of
porque
the
ya tuvimos
government,
experiencia
because
de
we
2 años
already
anteriores
had
y
experience
además,
of
bueno, en la gestión,
2 years before, and
aunque bueno, eso no se
not
puede
to talk
sintetizar.
about management.
No. Y, pero si tengo que referirme
But
a las
if I
políticas
have to
públicas en
refer
general de
to
memoria
public
en
memory
Argentina,
policies in general in
sí es
Argentina,
importante
it is
señalar que
important to
existió en
point
un
out
momento y
that
hasta
at some
hace un
point,
año,
until
casi 2 años,
almost 2 years
una
ago,
integralidad
there
y
was a
articulación entre las
comprehensiveness and
políticas públicas
articulation
de
between
memoria, verdad
memory
y
public
justicia.
policies of truth and
Entonces,
justice.
contábamos con
We
instituciones con las
counted
que
on
trabajábamos en
institutions with which
conjunto,
we would work
como el Archivo
jointly,
Nacional de la
like the
Memoria,
Memory
el
National
Centro Cultural de la
Archive,
Memoria
Cultural
Aroldo
Center,
Conti, el
Aroldo
Banco
Conti
Nacional de Datos
Center,
Genéticos, la
the
Comisión Nacional
Genetic
por el Derecho a la
Data
Identidad.
Bank, the
En el
National
plano de la
Commission for the Right to
justicia, en
Identity,
Argentina fueron condenadas
justice-wise,
1.202 personas por crímenes de lesa
1,200
humanidad y
people
los
were
juicios se
condemned
siguen
because of
desarrollando
crimes
y
against
les recomiendo
humanity
que
in
los vean en
Argentina.
vivo
There
a
are
través
still
de la
trials, and you can see them live,
También
watch
a
them
nivel
live.
legislativo, la importancia de en todos los
Legislative-wise,
campos
the importance on every
Estado,
field of the state,
aprobar leyes, la ley de sitios,
passing laws, the
las leyes
Places
reparatorias.
Act,
Entonces, para
Reparation
finalizar,
Acts. So
este muy breve
to
recorrido, quiero
conclude
decirles
this
que cuando hablamos de sitios de memoria,
chapter, recapitulation. When we speak of places of memory, we talk about research, archives, political will, consensus, participation, pedagogy of memory, conservation, the value of the testimonies of survivors, human rights bodies, justice, tourism and memory, heritage and memory, art and memory, communication and the regional point of view of places of memory and museums. I think that there are absolutely fundamental institutions for democracy. Hopefully here you can institutionalize places of memory, the building where the Madrid regional government is placed. You have to do that. Yes, we will accompany you, sharing whatever you need to do that. These places of memory and museums, not just the ESMA, are the legacy of nevermore that has to be visibilized and defended wherever we are. I think that places of memory will go on beyond these circumstances in Argentina, taking care of memory, transmitting truth, and accompanying justice. Thank you. Thank you, Mikey. Thank you for being understanding with time, because the audience will want to ask about memory policies with the threats of the far right. We have been closer than normal, precisely about those non-repetition policies. And at the other side of the mantis, Claudia Marchán, member of Londres 38, the Space of Memory in Chile, how orients the struggles for memory in the dictatorship, focusing on the social movements and memory debates after 2019. Thank you, Claudia, for coming.
Thank you very much to everyone. I am very grateful for this invitation, being able to participate in such a space which is so different. I want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and to Miguel Urban, who contacted us. He met us in Santiago de Chile. I'm going to talk about two events to talk about the memory space. London 38. London 38 is, of course, a street, an address in the center of Santiago. It's very near the presidential palace and the main road in Santiago, Alameda. In the year 25, it was built a house there, and within the Union Popular Government, it was bought for the headquarters of the Socialist Party. After the military coup, when you were getting out of your dictatorship, we were entering it. So it was occupied by the military police under the dictatorship, and it was made one of the main centers for detention in the country. It was used during a whole year. 73, 74, 2,000 people were tortured there. Many of them are still in disappearance. One died in exile because of the tortures. Afterwards, it was donated to an institution connected to the military, and they were using it until 2007. After a very long social process, the state declared it a national monument, and the state recovered it in 2008. From 2008 on, it is used and managed by social groups, social movements. From 2010 on, the collectives under the name Londres 38 get state funds to handle the space, to manage the space. And it is also very important to underscore that it was, for so long, it was a military institution. So it was recovered in 2008, very recently. It was a very long process promoted by the collectives of ex-detainees, families, and all the affected people. They were proposing a project to develop in the space, not without discussion among the different collectives, group around the house, and they were demanding funds to manage the space. This was granted from 2010 on, and right now we are discussing the budget for next year, and it is at risk because, as you know, we had a primary election where the right won, so we might have a far-right president, and they are trying to restrict the funds for these kind of places, these memory places. Very rapidly, I would like to say that Londres 38 has insisted in memory as a collective process, in an ongoing process. So we talk about memories in plural, not memory in the singular, memories that transcend the denounce and that look for the causes, the roots of the repressive violence that was unleashed.
Those reasons are identified in the Emancipatory Project of Popular Unity Party, but also the chance that military and civilians had to instaurate an economic political model without the way to stop it. It was adjusted, it was consolidated in democracy. In our conception, the abuse of human rights is not just around direct victims and their families. It is projected into the whole society because on that violence, the foundations of our present were built. So memory is not just a commemoration of past experiences, but rather recognizing critically social and political processes that were broken by state terrorism and its continuities in current struggles. The Londres 38 fields of action are history, talks to community through workshops and other events, digital archive, judicial action, communication and occupation of public space, conservation and recovery of architecture. Here, the first highlight, the first 40 years of the coup d'etat, we developed a collective process in which we invited more than 60 social organizations after that, fostered by they have been alienating into their own spaces of struggles. These mobilizations like students, environmental members of informal workers, dockers, against the privatization of pensions, feminist mobilizations, created a social organic fabric that would permit this process of co-construction for the commemoration of 40 years. Most of these organizations would identify the instauration of neoliberal model during the dictatorship and deepened in democracy with the current problems. So this process was easy. It culminated in the September 11 march through the streets of Santiago, where a propaganda brigade would distribute the posters that were developed during the year with their own slogans. But like you said in the morning, in the Greek case, without signatures, they were shared by everybody, political parties, organizations. I point this out because it contributed to the recognition of Londres 38 as a space of memory linked to current struggles, and allowed year 2019, the social explosion, the revolt. Rapidly, we were involved in mobilization. This was the second highlight I wanted to talk about. 2019, October 18, the mobilization of the youth in Santiago Metro initiated a revolt throughout the country. 2 days after, an assembly of social organizations was held at Londres 38. They called the first national strike for the 21st and the 23rd, with a paralyzed country and full repression with police and military in the streets. They used the space at the center of Santiago as a first as a hospital, provisional hospital, also legal support and psychological support for those who would come to the first help, first aid places, victims of shots, gases, and they presented 2,000 complaints that were sent to the national prosecutor. As you know, several international delegations, European MPs, Human Rights Commission of United Nations, Inter-American Commission, among others, visited the country, elaborated critical reports of human rights abuses in the country. In particular, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission met at Londres 38 with the security and legal commissions in order to know firsthand what was happening in the country. Then came COVID with lockdown, and popular mobilization stopped. Londres 38 went online, but as you know, the whole process was stopped in time. A key action was the presentation in 21 April, a complaint against the High Command of the Carabineros with the goal of showing patterns and systematic patterns of repression, proving that the High Command had to know the logics of repressive repressive action against the population. This action is still ongoing now. No.
Okay. La revuelta de 2010. Yo voy apurada por mi tiempo, pero bueno. Okay. Okay. Perdón.
2019 revolt was a powerful process that marks our history, recent history, in spite of the discourses that tried to forget the challenge against the system it meant and was nurtured after 20 years of neoliberal dictatorship. Unfortunately, the remains that we see more clearly is impunity and powerlessness of offering our body in mobilization that today are despised by many. We have to find out all other remains of community, solidarity, collective struggles, longings for change, and a less unequal and fair society that cannot have disappeared, must have been kept in some place of our hearts and bodies, of our memories. 6 years after the revolt, let's remember that 20 people died but were killed, 464 people that lost an eye, hundreds of people detained, thousands of complaints against police violence, and only 3% of the complaints ended with a sentence against the perpetrators. This impunity has its background in the impunity of human rights abuses during the dictatorship 52 years after the coup. Out of the hundreds of killed and detained people, only some 300 have been given to their families. More than 1,000 cases are still open for crimes against the humanity during the dictatorship. Only 0.5 of torture survivors have had trials with a favorable sentence for the tortured people. In Chile, the post-dictatorship is marked by impunity. Impunity that in the case of 2019 revolt has entailed the suicide of 4 victims of ocular trauma and a prisoner. From our point of view, the lack of comprehensive reparation, impunity, and criminalization of the revolt that the right wing has termed as a criminal explosion and the strengthening of repressive laws are at the origin of these youth suicides. They are the consequence of state carelessness for the rights of the victims and the fairness of the claims of the movement and the revolt. Throughout these years, we are convinced that we live in a permanent state of exception, like in Gualmapu, where the Mapuche communities live, a militarized zone where this juridical tool, the state of exception, has been continued in more than 60 consecutive occasions since its declaration in May 22. State of exception that allows for the suppression of rights through legislative political processes and narrative that legitimize it. So we arrive to the current moment and the challenges before us. Before the growing negationism and anticipating the victory of a pro-dictatorship candidate, a member of the economic elite, and declared pro-Pinochet, we've been discussing how to face this moment that, on the other hand, has a global correspondence that we were anticipating after the restoration process, after the 2019 revolt and the failures of the Pinochet constitution reform. Trying to address this battle for discourses, we started a campaign a week ago, a campaign for historical truth based on the very declarations, statements of the perpetrators of the dictatorship. This campaign has had a big hit in social networks. It challenges us to get out of social networks in order to advance in convergence with other political and social actors to develop new forms of construction of collective memory in a social fabric that is pretty atomized with association practices harmed by dictatorship and that later governments ignored or repressed or co-opted. Networks and collective works with all of those who have a transformative horizon, able to project a possible future in an inhabitable world for decent, free, and equal people. As you can see, I'm concluding, after the return to democracy in 1990, this hasn't been a linear process at all. A first decade without memory, trying to erase the claims for justice and memory. They said justice as far as is possible, but then came a rise of social mobilization that would identify in the transformation bloody transformations of the dictatorship, the origin of the problems and claims. They also recognize that democracy only deepened and institutionalized those inequalities. Those mobilizations, together with the work of the sites of memory and human rights, were able to permeate society with democratic values and the recognition of certain truths until now relativized or hidden, like human rights abuses and the value of emancipatory projects, until the big mobilizations of 2019 with the big challenge that it meant. Now we are in a moment in which we go back to the first years of denialist discourses that want to equate responsibility for both sides and that criminalize any alternative critical proposal against the current model. But as yesterday, like others, understood that keeping historical memory alive is an ethical duty and a form of resistance, that the defense of human rights is the fundamental pillar for our coexistence in the present and future. Today we say, before denialism and impunity, memory, justice, and truth. Thank you, Claudia. Of course, many questions will arise about the context. We have short-term last to end this panel, and thank you for your patience, Jaime. Jaime Pastor, political scientist and member of the board of Viento Sur Journal, an expert on democratization process and authoritarian repressive transformation in public space with recognition as an expert in the public space.
Thanks to you all for attending this meeting and for inviting me. I would like to begin questioning the title of this panel, the idea of a third wave, after listening to our comrades in Argentina and Chile to talk about a third wave, third democratization wave. It is a bit a fiction, kind of a fiction. And it is, we can see that it was interested. Samuel Huntington coined this idea in 1991, because also the concept transition didn't exist before the Spanish transition. There was no talk around transition. You could talk about revolution or reform, but not transition. So it is very important to question this. Huntington was one of the signatories of the report, of the trilateral report of 1975, where there were all these democratization demands after the 68th wave. So first of all, we should question this idea of the third wave, which is a politologue theory with lots of vested interest. And of course, well, I've been hearing throughout the different panels, we have this concept of democracy, but of course there are different concepts around democracy. There is a constitutional concept that puts constitution in the center. There is also an instrumental concept, or that puts all the emphasis around the liberal democracy. And you have also a substantive concept of democracy, and of course I feel part of it, which goes to the moments of democracy, the historical moments of democracy, where you had a relative democracy, of course, from the idealized experience in Athens to the commons experiences, and of course, what meant the Paris Commune in the 19th century. So democracy as the self-govern of the demos in all the scales of society, in all the scales of life, and not only as a representative democracy, but in the capability of taking decisions. So I will reclaim myself as part of this legacy of radical democracy. Of course, we can talk about democratization process and the democratization process, but they coexist. For example, the Portuguese Revolution in the 76. So we have to see the history in the long term, in the framework of the class struggle and in the framework of the different struggles we are seeing in the different scales of domination and exploitation. And of course, it's a historical struggle. Democracy never gets consolidated. This is an antinomian, an absurd. You cannot say democracy is consolidated because democracy is a process. And of course, you have another concept of democracy, which is polyarchy, where you have a government, a shared government between different elites, representative elites. In this sense, we can say that from 74 on, yes, you have, well, after the Cold War, you have a process of building, of creation of liberal democracies. Yes, they are the liberal democracies, and at the same time, for example, Costas Cornetis has mentioned Pulanzas. Pulanzas in those years was already speaking about authoritarian state. Others, as Ernest Mangel, were talking about a strong state. That you already saw this tension. Well, you had these democratization processes that were clashing against a tendency to create these strong states, these authoritarian states, because then also you have the neoliberal wave, the long neoliberal wave that began in Chile. So, all these factors, Huntington he's not integrating all these factors in his analysis. And it's important to question it and to signal the limits that you can see in this process from the beginning.
That alleged democratizing wave, precisely the Portuguese Revolution was no transition. It was a break-in. A break with the Spanish one, as you have told, that becomes a model. That's an important thing. To point out that what we have witnessed is a coexistence between a capitalism always more neoliberal and democracies always more authoritarian, always more elitist, and that in order to go rapidly, there have been some highlights, important, in which there has been relevant crisis. The fundamental thing would be to place in the 2008 recession as the turning point, after which always more it is shown the difficult compatibility between neoliberal capitalism that goes through its biggest crisis of its accumulation regime until then, difficult compatibility with the frameworks of the very frameworks of liberal democracy. Afterwards, what we see is a reaction against that neoliberal austerity that is being imposed anti-democratically in the European case, Greece is the turning point, is the forced battle between people that refuses the memorandum of the Troika and a governing elite, European, the very Troika that says that no, it's not possible. Jean-Claude Juncker said that whatever the result of the referendum, we won't pay any attention to it. That would be the general framework to situate myself. What we witnesses in that framework, in accelerated form of 2008, it's true that in the first phase there were popular reactions, even before in Latin America, more powerful, like the constituent processes being developed in different countries there, but that in Europe were soonly aborted. In Spanish, we have the May 15th movement. Like Xavi said, on that basis, the notion of regime of 78, the older one, we call it the regime of the reform. But there is a questioning of that regime that doesn't end achieving that breaking process. That I want to point out there is another chance, which is the Catalan referendum, October the 1st, 2017, where there was also a chance to formulate the best conditions, of course, because there are some limits in the process about what does it mean, the forced relationship between that Catalan challenge and the rest of Spain, the state, but there was blindness of the most part of the left, at least to try to avoid the repressive force of the regime with the king at the head, the new king. So what we see in all countries is that erasure of the traditional party system, oligarchic party system, of bipartisan alternates doesn't work in any country. Macron says that he's extreme center, but he doesn't convince anybody. We could also talk about of the reactionary wave under which we are. Now what we see is that there is some kind of authoritarianism that is even more dangerous, the reactionary authoritarians that we can call among the concept is closer to traverso, post-fascism. And I think it fits with what the Greek colleagues say. It's true that some have nostalgia of the past, but others, they want to build a form of domination in a very different context. With regards of the 30s, they cannot reproduce. I always say that in the Spanish case, it Vox governed. Yeah, we would back to the 66, 76. The struggle between the return to a pre-dictatorial or semi-dictatorial regime, or rather initiating a de-democratization process. But we shouldn't forget there are some political scientists. I'm a pensioned political science professor, Adam Przeworski, for instance. I think is interesting analyst now. He lives in the U.S. writing about what's going on there, but he says that it's more complicated. The problem is not the police reform. That's not the problem. The problem is really to build a democratic political culture able really to counter that break with the anti-fascist consensus that is happening globally. I don't want to enter into polemics with my colleague, but I think that the fundamental problem is that we cannot say that when the far right presents an alternative and it's getting the support of the super techno-oligarchy at the global scale, we know that the problem is structural. And that's what Adam Przeworski recognizes. The problem is social economic inequality. The problem is, of course, in the political culture. So the kind of transition we need is the change two. Przeworski talks of two kinds of change. He talks of a type of change that are institutional contingent transactions that may happen, but if you don't solve the structural problems, they turn into long-term problems. They won't happen in the 80s, but yes, they will appear later. And the second type of change is about structural transformations. Is when he speaks of socio-economic transformations, that environmental, gender, national, ethnic, that's what the problem is. The problem is that we have to talk of democratization in those terms of democratic transformations in the general political level, but that must be necessarily accompanied by structural transformations if we really want to have a real government of the people with another classical formula, by the people, for the people, and of the people. The Spanish transition, he also says, it was a transaction, and I would add asymmetric transaction between moderates of the regime and moderates of the opposition, and was the result, the response to the street mobilization. I also would like to ask Xavi, what does he think about another program, which is the Nicolas Sartorius documentary, The Conquest of Democracy. It showed the role of the street, but then in the last chapter, they end up saying, yeah, but Suarez needed Carrillo, and Carrillo also needed Suarez. So the closing of radicalization, not mobilization, that would last until '79. But the closure of the process of radicalization by the social movements taking place in those years is stopped by that pact, that triple pact, amnesty law, Moncloa pacts, and the monarchy constitution. That's what stops the radicalization process, although mobilization goes on, but with no sense. Where is the democratization process ended? With the coup d'etat, February 23rd, 81. It is the attempt of closing, reflected with the LOAPA, reflected then, unfortunately, with what we still call the last battle of the transition, the NATO referendum. After the entry into the economic European community, the last chance to relaunch a democratizing process that had been frustrated before by Felipe González, saying that he was pro-NATO. You know that now González is repented of even organizing that referendum. 5 minutes. So, and then our topic is clear that that's why Chbosky, it's quite interesting because it's a replica of what Costas told. I always had to support that in the 90s. Philip Schmidt has Guillermo O'Donnell when they would distinguish between liberalization and democratization, which is good to enter into polemics with those that say that the democracy started with the law for political reform or Torquato's script. It's true that it has nothing to do with that. So I think that there, what we have to say openly, the fact that it was an asymmetric transition, contingent, and that left unsolved structural problems, including the Catalan case, the national question, because the response to the national question was the autonomic state that tried to neutralize the Catalan issue and the Basque issue, but not solving the most clear shortcoming of structural shortcoming of the political transition in Spain. So going back to the title, after the third wave, state legacies, breaking points and continuities, I would say that the first state legacy is not having generated an anti-Francoist political culture. And there, in our journal, Viento Sur, we have an interview with Xavi Domènech and Carmen Ochoa that is here. It's important to remember what they point out, because normally we talk, and it's been said in another lecture, it's not about knowing that there was a dictatorship, but rather to understand why there was a dictatorship and why we had to fight against the dictatorship. That's what was never justified by the majority left in Spain. And along these lines, I think it's the worst legacy of the Spanish transition would be precisely that political culture that is not anti-Franco, that is neutral among, about fascism and anti-fascism is based on permanent oblivion. So the reaction of González and Guerra is understandable now, the reaction today, because many militants of the Communist Party and others, they said yes to the Constitution, but we'll keep on struggling to go forward. But the problem is that soon this Atado and Bien Atado was imposed on Felipe González, and Alfonso Guerra have ended believing in that you cannot open the Pandora's box of the transition. That's the word's legacy. The other day we were remembering the 90th anniversary of the foundation of the Unified Workers' Party, Marxist Party, poem, the program of Joaquín Maurín in the 30s, fundamentally is still democratic task, democrat anti-capitalist, the issue of the church, the agrarian reform, national, the social question, and also the environmental one, women's struggle that was already openly given. Remember that the right to abortion was recognized by both the Generalitat of Catalonia and Federica Montseny, the minister. I think it is important to remember that huge harm. Of course, there's still a parasite monarchy. So this would be my balance. Some civic freedoms I discussed with colleagues saying they deny that there were any reform, pact reform. So we have to defend the recognition of a certain freedoms and social rights, but social rights are just on the guiding lines of the Constitution, not fundamental right. The right to housing is not a fundamental right. That's also a pending question that is still open. What I wanted to say most of all is to point out that today we should break with this thesis about ways, but process of tension at the global scale, not Western or Eurocentric scale. And secondly, we're witnessing a transformation of demoliberal regimes into reactionary authoritarian regimes, and that's the tendency, the dominant tendency. And that's what we should know, because the driving force are big Western power. The alternative is not China, because what Trump and the others, they envy the quinquennial plans. In China, you can decide for 5 years without elections. Those are all not alternatives. In the Spanish case, we are witnessing that. There was a regime crisis. From it was neutralized, it was defeated, that outside challenge, but now we are facing is a struggle inside the regime about the new reform and its meaning, and or a counter reform. We cannot be indifferent. We have to distinguish between a degraded liberal democracy and an authoritarian pre-fascist or post-fascist reaction. We have to fight that threat, knowing that we shouldn't lose sight of the horizon, which is a bet on radical democracy. Thank you.